Dawn arrived softly across the wide Wyoming plains, spilling gold across the earth as if the sun were brushing its fingers along every blade of grass just to wake the world gently. Noya Redbird stood in that gentle light with her satchel pressed to her chest, her breath trembling as she looked back at the ranch that had sheltered her these last few months. The morning smelled of horses and dust, of memory and hesitation, and she fought the urge to turn around and run back inside before anyone noticed her standing there like a secret about to be revealed. She told herself she didn't belong. The townsfolk had made that clear with their murmurs, with their pity, with the way their eyes moved past her as though she weren't worth lingering on. She tightened her grip on the satchel, steadying herself as she whispered that leaving was a kindness, even if the words tasted bitter on her tongue. The path before her shimmered with early light, but the wind carried the remnants of last night's cruel whispers as surely as a messenger carrying letters not meant to be read. "She's only here because Colt feels sorry for her," they had said, unaware she stood just outside the bunkhouse door. "She ain't family. She's a mouth to feed." The words landed in her chest like stones thrown by hands she had once hoped would soften. She had worked hard, done her share, but in a town like this, where people guarded their judgments the way they guarded their fences, her presence was easily misunderstood. She stepped forward anyway, each footfall a tiny rebellion against the ache blooming beneath her ribs, and yet she couldn't help wondering if anyone would care come noon when someone finally noticed her empty bunk. Up on the ridge overlooking the pasture, Hania Colt paused with one hand on his horse's saddle, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a lone figure walking away from the ranch. The sun lit the edges of her hair like fire, and the sight of her retreating silhouette sent something uneasy spiraling through him. Hania wasn't a man given to panic, but he knew the look of a heart breaking quietly. He had lived with that expression himself ever since the woman he once intended to marry told him he was too soft for the life she wanted. Too gentle. Too patient. Too everything she felt she didn't need. Noya Redbird walking away in silence tugged at a part of him he had worked hard to bury, and he found himself tightening the saddle straps with a speed fueled by instinct more than thought. He didn't call out to her yet. He simply mounted and guided his horse down the slope, unsure of what words he'd find but certain he couldn't let her disappear into the morning without at least trying to understand. He approached her quietly, letting his horse slow to a walk so he wouldn't startle her. She didn't look up, though he knew she sensed him. Noya always sensed more than she spoke. Her shoulders were stiff, her posture small but stubborn, as though she were bracing herself against more than just the cold morning air. When he offered her his canteen, she refused with a small shake of her head, and he could tell the gesture wasn't about thirst, it was about guilt, about believing she didn't deserve even simple kindness. That thought stung him more than he expected. He dismounted and walked beside her, the soft crunch of gravel under their boots creating a rhythm that felt steadier than the silence between them. He wanted to ask why she was leaving, but the question felt too heavy, too sharp for this fragile morning, so he waited, trusting that the truth would come when it was ready. She didn't keep him waiting long. Her voice came out soft, barely more than a breath stolen by the wind, as she confessed that she had overheard the ranch hands speaking of her like she was some burden Hania had taken in out of duty. She said she didn't want to stay where she wasn't welcome, didn't want to weigh down a man who already carried enough. Hania listened, his jaw tightening, not in anger at her, but at the smallness forced upon her by people who mistook quiet for weakness. He told her that folks judged him too, that they called him the softest colt in the family, unfit for long trails or rough seasons. The admission surprised even him, but the way Noya's gaze flickered toward him, just for a heartbeat, made it feel worth the vulnerability. And yet, before anything more could settle between them, a gust of wind swept across the plain, carrying with it the first low rumble of an approaching storm. The sky behind them darkened fast, a purple bruise blooming across the horizon as if the earth itself were preparing for a fight. Noya hesitated, torn between continuing forward and turning back, but the storm made the decision for them with a sudden crack of thunder that made her flinch. Hania touched her elbow gently, just enough to guide, not enough to claim, and pointed toward an old trapper's cabin half buried against a slope. They made for it as rain began to spit at the ground, gathering intensity with every pounding step. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm had unfurled its full fury, hammering the roof so hard the boards shuddered with each breath of wind. Inside, the air was dry but cold, and shadows clung to the corners like memories that refused to leave. Noya shivered once, trying to hide it, but Hania noticed. He always noticed. When she offered him her blanket despite her shaking, he gently placed it back around her shoulders, his fingers brushing her collarbone with a tenderness that felt both new and ancient at the same time. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the cabin walls, illuminating her face in sharp silver bursts. In one of those fleeting moments of light, her composure cracked, her eyes filling with tears as she admitted she didn't want to make trouble for him or be something he had to protect out of obligation. She said she didn't want to stay somewhere she wasn't wanted. She had left before anyone could ask her to. Hania stepped closer, not touching her hands yet, just letting the closeness bridge the chasm between their fears. He told her softly that she had never been trouble to him, never been a burden, not once. He said she steadied him in ways she didn't even realize, that her presence quieted the noise in his mind the same way dawn quieted the night. The words left him raw and honest, stripped of the armor he usually wore. When he finally took her hand, it wasn't a claim or a request, it was the offering of a man who had more wounds than he cared to count, reaching out to someone who carried her own scars with more grace than she knew. The storm raged on outside, but inside something shifted, something warm and steady and startling in its clarity. They sat close, not touching more than their hands, but sharing the kind of silence that eases pain instead of deepening it. Hours passed in that muted sanctuary of rain and heartbeat, and when dawn finally began to creep back across the sky, the cabin felt transformed. The world outside glistened with newness, the earth dark and rich from the rain, and the sky clear in a way that made everything feel possible again. They walked back toward the ranch side by side, not rushing, not hiding, their steps aligned like two paths finally merging after too long wandering alone. People stared when they approached, whispers rising like a familiar wind, but Noya didn't shrink. Hania walked beside her with quiet certainty, his presence steady enough to silence even the boldest tongues. When they reached the fence line, he turned to her and asked in a voice low and earnest, if he could court her in the way of both her people and his, letting the question linger in the golden morning air like a promise waiting for breath to give it life. Their lives after that unfolded not in grand gestures but in the soft accumulation of small, patient moments, wildflowers he left on her windowsill, the quiet lunches they shared beneath the cottonwoods, the way she fixed his torn shirts with careful stitches and he brushed her horse without being asked. They married in a ceremony simple and sacred, sage smoke curling into the sky like prayers rising from the earth. And though life on the plains remained hard at times, storms still came, rumors still whispered, the weight of loneliness no longer lived in their home. Hania loved with the steadiness of mountains. Noya loved with the resilience of roots clinging to desert soil. Together they built a place where dignity had room to breathe, where love grew slow like river stones smoothed by time, and where each dawn brought new trails to explore, their silhouettes always side by side as they rode toward futures neither had dared dream before. And if you, reading now, have ever felt too small for the world or too heavy for someone's heart, remember this. You are not a burden simply because someone once failed to carry your worth with care. Sometimes the gentlest souls are forged in the storms they survive, and sometimes the people meant to walk beside you arrive quietly, without warning, offering their presence instead of promises. So hold on, though the road may be wide and wild, there is a dawn waiting with your name hidden in its light, gathering its courage to rise for you the moment you dare to look toward it.